The first question you need to answer is, which Bible will I use? There are multiple ways to answer this question. For some of you, your choice is between an electronic Bible on your computer or phone and a physical printed Bible. For the purposes of this assignment, working from a printed Bible will be most useful. In the first place, a printed Bible allows you to take in a whole chapter at once without having to scroll line by line. This gives you a sense of the structure of the chapter as a whole. Secondly, when you are able to see the chapter as a whole, you can also get a feel for how the chapter lies in relation to the chapters on either side, and to the book as a whole. Inasmuch as the first part of your report is to do a simple outline of the text, this kind of experience of the text will be a big help. A second way to approach the which Bible question is to decide between verse Bibles and paragraph Bibles. You may have noticed that the Bible is composed of many parts that we call books. The first 4 books of the New Testament, for example, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each book of the Bible, except for the very shortest, is composed of multiple chapters. The book of Matthew, for example, has 28 chapters. Each chapter is, in turn, broken up into verses. It's important to know that for the most part, the chapter and verse divisions were not original to the text. In other words, when Matthew sat down and wrote Matthew, he didn't think to himself, "Okay, I am now going to write chapter 1. I will put 25 verses into this chapter. I will begin by writing verse 1. When I am finished with verse 1, I will write verse 2. The chapter and verse divisions were added later as a tool to help readers through the text. This was especially helpful in the era before the invention of the printing press and the standardization of books in the late 15th century, a mere 500 years ago. Imagine being in church and the preacher says, "Okay, people, I will be reading from the book of Matthew. Turn in Matthew to about 2/3 of the way through. Look for the word therefore." It's much easier to have a common reference system, like we have with chapters and verses. Some Bible editions present the text merely in chapter and verse format. This makes it really easy for common reference. But how many books that you read are structured this way? Not very many, I bet. Much of what we read comes in the form of paragraphed text. Writers combine their sentences into paragraphs, where each paragraph is somehow united in terms of subject matter or conceptuality. Some Bible editions present the text in paragraphs, showing how the verses connect with each other. Like chapter and verse divisions, however, the idea of breaking the text into paragraphs is usually not original to the text. Like the others, it is an artifact of the translation and editorial process. If you are outlining a text, particularly as a beginner to the process, working from a Bible edition that presents the text in paragraph form will be a big help to you. When you go about identifying the major divisions of a chapter, you can be assured, at least at this stage of the game, that each section will likely be composed of whole paragraphs. In some cases, a single paragraph will be a section unto itself. In most cases, however, each section will have multiple paragraphs, at least 2, that is. Some of you like easier work. If you think that way, you'll likely want to choose a Bible that uses paragraphs. So you've chosen a Bible edition to use. You have a chapter in front of you. How do you go about identifying the sections for your outline? When you're identifying divisions in a text, look for shifts in time, place, and subject. Consider the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of John, for example. Look at verse 1. Notice the setting. The author gives us both a temporal, social, and geographical location. It is on the 3rd day, at a wedding, and at Cana in Galilee. As you read the next several verses, some of which are descriptive of the events, others reporting conversation, you see the story of Jesus' visit to the wedding unfold. John then reflects on the story in verse 11. Now look at the next verse, verse 12. What do you notice about the setting? I again notice temporal, social, and geographical location. The action is described as after this, Jesus with his mother, brothers, and disciples, and to Capernaum. Compared to verses 1 through 11, this verse doesn't contain much action. Having read this verse, however, we can see that verses 1 through 11 make up a coherent section. It is a story of Jesus visiting a wedding at a town in Galilee named Cana. While there, he turns water into wine. Verse 11 summarizes the action of the section. Now that you've identified the first section, John 2, verses 1 through 11, pick a descriptive title. Some ideas that come to mind include Jesus attends a wedding, or Jesus turns water into wine at a wedding, or Jesus does his first sign, or Jesus saves the day. Notice that there is no single right answer here. Each of my proposed titles does describe the section. When you name your sections, think about which title is clearest and best describes the content. Be sure and come up with your own titles here. Some of you will have discovered that some Bibles do this work for you. I want your work, not your reporting the work of others. Let's proceed in the chapter. We've noted that verse 12 is a transition away from the section in verses 1 through 11. What about verse 13? Does it continue the story that begins in verse 12, or does it shift again? What do you notice about the setting? What is the temporal location? The geographical location? Verse 13 begins with, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover. This is the temporal location, the place and time. How does this compare to the temporal location of verse 12? Well, we don't know when the events of either verses 1 through 11 or verse 12 occur relative to the Jewish Passover. We can judge that this phrase anchors the verse in a different frame of reference, even if the difference is only a couple of days. What about the location? In verse 12, Jesus is in Capernaum, a city in Galilee. Now in verse 13, we see that Jesus is going up to Jerusalem, a city in Judea, and thus a clear transition to a different place. Since I see this temporal and geographical transition in verse 13, I would judge that verse 12 is a very short transitional section. Do you have to read it this way? I can tell you that the Bible edition I'm looking at doesn't do that. By its titling, I see that the editors consider verse 12 to be the beginning of a section that includes the rest of the chapter. Our assignment, however, is not to report what the editors of our Bible edition say, but to read the text for ourselves. Some might consider it inelegant to have such a short section, a single verse, sandwiched between two longer sections. It doesn't bother me, so I'm going to make it a section of its own. I'll call it, Jesus Takes Some Time Off in Capernaum. What do I expect you to do here or in similar circumstances? Use your judgment. If you can make a case for a verse or a set of verses being a section, whether short or long, that's fine. As long as you can give good reasons for your judgment, that's fine. So in verse 13, we see that it's time for Passover, and Jesus is going to Jerusalem. The following verses, 14 through 22, Jesus makes trouble in the temple and engages in argument with the local people. They think he's gone off the deep end and demand an explanation. Verses 13 through 22 cohere as a description of this event. But what about verses 23 through 25? The location and time are still the same. It's still Passover, and he's still in Jerusalem. But the perspective has changed. The dispute about Jesus' action in the temple is past, and we see a reflection on Jesus' whole visit to Jerusalem. If you notice the structure of the chapter, you may observe that verses 23 through 25 stand in relation to verses 13 through 22 in a way similar to how verse 11 stands to verses 1 through 10. In both cases, the action has happened. Now John steps back and reflects on the significance of what has happened. Some of you might be inclined to treat these two reflective sets of verses as different sections. If you were doing a detailed outline of the chapter, I'd expect that. In this assignment, however, I don't expect you to go into that level of detail, though it's fine if you do. My personal judgment is that working from the parallel structure of verses 1 through 11, I'll consider verses 13 through 25 to be a whole section. I'll let you imagine what would work as a good title for this section. Remember, there's not one right answer to this. There's not a single correct descriptive title. Now, there are plenty of wrong ones. If I give it the title, Jesus Visits New York City, or Abner Plays Baseball, both are clearly wrong, since they have nothing to do with the content of the text. The way to judge the adequacy of any suggested title for a section is by asking, how well does it fit what is in the text? John chapter 2 is a primarily narrative section of Scripture, Let's take a look at a different genre and see how to identify sections there. Let's consider Jesus' teaching in Matthew 13. Matthew 13:1 gives us a setting. It's the same day. Jesus goes out to the lake and gets in a boat. He talks to the crowd. Verses 1 through 2 describe this setting. In verses 3 through 9, Jesus tells a story, described in verse 3 as a parable. What happens in verse 10? Are there any changes that might indicate a transition to a new section? We don't see any mention to a temporal transition, no later that day or after he spoke to the crowd. We also don't see any shift in location. In fact, there is no mention of location at all. But consider the audience, the characters in view. In verses 1 through 9, the crowds around the lake are in view. Jesus is teaching them. Who is the audience beginning in verse 10? The verse shows the disciples asking Jesus a question. Here the shift of scenery is in terms of who is in view. The crowd may still be present, but they're no longer central. In verse 10, the disciples ask a question of Jesus. Why do you speak in parables? The ensuing verses report Jesus' answer. Jesus explains why he speaks in parables. This section, verses 10 through 17, coheres as a question and answer. The disciples have asked their question. Jesus answers it. What happens in verse 18? Now we see something different. It is no longer directly part of Jesus' answer to the disciples' question, though it does follow on it. In the explanatory section, Jesus has said that he teaches in parables, so outsiders will be slow to understand, since full understanding of his message, at this stage at least, is reserved for insiders, the disciples. In verse 18, he begins an explanation of the parable of the sower from the beginning of the chapter, the story that elicited the disciples' question in the first place. Jesus' explanation of the parable runs from verses 18 through 23. So far in my reading of the text, I've identified 3 sections in the first part of this chapter. The first section, verses 1 through 9, I'll call Jesus tells the parable of the sower. I'll call the section, verses 10 through 17, Jesus and the disciples discuss why he teaches in such a confusing way. Finally, I'll call verses 18 through 23, Jesus explains the parable of the sower to his disciples. It's important to remember here that these are my titles. They are not the one right way to name the sections. When you read a text, use your judgment about what is in the text to come up with the title. Find a title that fits the text and that you think will most help you and others understand the text. There's a lot more to Matthew 13, but I'm going to pull back a bit and not look at it quite as closely. As you read the rest of the chapter, look for structural clues to help you identify the sections. One thing I notice is the repeated phrase, Jesus told another parable. I see versions of this in verses 24, 31, and 33. Notice what comes after this phrase in these instances. In each case, he opens the parable with, the kingdom of heaven is like. Now consider verses 44, 45, and 47. In these cases, we don't see the Jesus told a parable formula, but we do see the kingdom of heaven is like formula. This kind of language points us to the conclusion that Jesus is telling different parables. As we identify our sections, we can assign each parable to its own section. Alternatively, you might decide that these sets of parables are not worthy of their own section, and you might lump them together in a single section with a title something like, Jesus tells several parables of the kingdom. Again, for this assignment, this is a judgment call on your part. Go with what produces the most clarity and understanding. As you read the text, you also notice some parts of the chapter that are not parables. Verses 34 through 35 is a reflection of how Jesus' teaching in parables fulfills the words of the prophet. Though the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John are very different in style, you can notice the similar technique here. Both here in Matthew 13 and back in the earlier text we looked at, John 2, we saw the reporting of events followed by the author stepping back and offering analysis or a summary of the significance of what has been reported. This technique is common in the Bible and other literature, so it can help you to be aware of it. You might also find it to be a useful technique to use in your own writing sometimes. What do you notice in Matthew 13:36 through 43? This section is neither a parable nor a reflection on the telling of parables. Instead, it is like the section in Matthew 13:18 through 23, where Jesus explained the parable of the sower. Here he explains the meaning of the parable of the weeds. Do you notice any similarities between these two explanatory sections? Though we don't have any clear description of the setting for the parables beginning in verse 24, this explanatory section in verse 36 tells us that Jesus left the crowd, implying that the previous parables have been addressed to the crowds. Now in verse 36, having withdrawn from the crowds, the disciples ask for an explanation of the parable of the weeds. Jesus proceeds in verses 37 through 43 to give the explanation. I'd identify this explanatory set of verses as a section and assign it a title. After this section, we can see Jesus telling parables from verse 44 through 50. We see nothing in the text to indicate whether his audience is the crowd or the disciples. If we consider verses 51 and 52 as part of this section, the similarity of the conversation here to previous conversation with the disciples might suggest that these are all addressed to the disciples rather than to the crowd. At this stage, given the fact that you are beginners working on the beginning level of Bible reading, consider this a judgment call as to whether you want to consider each of these parables and the conversation as a single section or as multiple sections. If you're doing a more detailed outline, you'd likely first identify the whole section together and then identify the parts as subsections of that larger whole. Matthew 13:53 gives us some clear transition words to separate what follows from the rest of the chapter 13. Notice the temporal and geographical changes. When Jesus had finished these parables, and he moved on from there. These clues show the reader that we now have a new section. As I read these verses through the end of the chapter, I see a single conversation going on. Inasmuch as it is a single conversation, I'd call it a single coherent section as well, and come up with an appropriate title. Having read the whole chapter carefully, identified the sections, and given each section a title, you've probably done the hardest part of the Bible report. With this in hand, you'll have most of what you need to complete the third and fourth parts of the Bible report for the chapter in view. The third part of the assignment is to identify the major things in each chapter. Since you've read the chapter and created a rough outline, you already know the answer to this question. All you have left to do is to consider your outline and summarize what happened. For Matthew 13, I'd report the following important things. Jesus teaches in parables. Jesus explains why he teaches in parables. And we see a clear difference in Jesus' approach with the crowds and with his disciples. As with identifying and titling sections, there is room for your own judgment here. What I'm looking for is a response that engages with the content of the text. Now you could simply summarize the chapter and many others by saying something like, Jesus talked a lot. Now, this is true, but it doesn't tell me you did any more than skim the text. You may even have done nothing more than used a red-letter edition of the Bible, and noticed there was lots of red. I'm looking for you to demonstrate engagement with the text. Notice something else about the way I reported what I consider the important happenings in the text. I used complete sentences. Each sentence has a subject and a verb. Teachers don't ask students to write in complete sentences simply to annoy you or to make your jobs harder. We ask for complete sentences for the sake of clarity. When you write a complete sentence, it is much more likely that your audience will understand what you're trying to say. Talking is easy. Producing understanding is difficult. What about the fourth section of the report? Here you are asked to report on what you and people like you, whoever you want to take that description, find of value in the text. As with identifying the major things in the text, having your outline of the chapter in hand will help you immensely. Here, however, we are becoming much more subjective, much more in the realm of your own judgment. You know what you and your peers are likely to find of value better than I do. Here are some examples, however, from what I find of value in Matthew 13. If I want to understand what Jesus says, I have to pay close attention and work at it. If I don't understand something Jesus says or does, I can ask him about it. He will not be offended. The words of Jesus have a different effect on different people. In some cases, this is a matter of things beyond my control. For example, if I'm likened to a kind of soil, soil doesn't have any control over its own quality. On the other hand, Jesus clearly invites people to respond to what he says and take it to heart. If this is so, at least some forms of response are up to me. I am responsible for what I do with the teaching of Jesus. I hope this has helped you with the first part of the Bible reports. The second section of the Bible report, questioning the text, is a rather different exercise, so I will treat it differently.